If you discover that you can't edit a file that you want to, or if you find that all of your friends can edit a file that you don't want them to, then that's an issue of permissions. This lecture will give you the basics of permissions on a Linux file system and how to change them. Before anything else, how can we figure out what permissions actually are? The easiest way is to run an ls command using ls-l. The L stands for long. When we run ls-l, we see a whole lot of information that tells us everything we need to know about permissions. This is the big brunt of it, but I'll get into that last. Over here, this is the owner of the file. This is the group of the file. This is the file size. This is the date the file was created. And this is the file name. And the highlighting here is going to be different depending on what type of permissions there are. So here this is green, which means we know it's an executable file. And this is green also. This is blue, which means it's a directory. These are black, which means they're regular files. And this is pink, and I have no idea what that means. The owner of the file is usually the person who created that file, unless either the owner or root runs chown on that file to change the owner. Groups are used in order to share files, so you can give a group to a file, and then several different people can have the same group, which means that they would all be able to edit that file. And then what we're here to talk about, the permissions. The first letter here is going to be either a D or a dash. D means directory, dash means normal file. The next 9 are going to be read, write, and execute. The first 3 are whether the user who owns the file can read, write, and execute. The next 3 are whether the group that owns the file can read, write, and execute. And the last 3 are whether other people can read, write, or execute. In other words, these are for global, these are for working with a group, and these are for yourself. Reading is pretty self-evident. Can I open the file? Can I see what's in it? Writing means can I make changes to it and then save them? Execute means can I run this? So if you compile something and want to run the code, then that would have to have execute flag set. And there are these 3 levels of granularity so that you can keep files private to yourself, or so that you can choose if you want to have everybody be able to access it. Now these are a little bit different with regard to directories than they are to regular files, because what would it really mean to read or write or execute a directory? In the context of Linux, reading a directory means listing everything that's inside of it. So you can run ls on any directory that you have read permissions for. Writing means changing the contents of that directory. So when you are making a file inside of a directory, you are changing the contents of that directory. Similarly, when you're deleting a file, you're changing the contents of that directory. In other words, you can only create or delete files if you have the right permissions for the directory that those files are in. Execute means, can I use this directory in a path? In other words, if I want to open a file in a given directory, or if I want to get the attributes of a file in a directory, I would need to use it in the path. So for instance, here my path is currently home/work/cs1u/search/recurse. If any of those directories didn't have their execute bits set, then that would mean that I would not be able to be here, and I wouldn't be able to access any of these files and see exactly what's in them. So you can see here, some directory doesn't have its execute bit set, which means I wouldn't be able to go in there and do the same things that I'm doing here. And you can see, when I ls-al to list all, you can see dot, the current directory, has its execute bit set, which means I can be in here and use the current directory in my path and use these files. Now you know what permissions are, let's talk about how to change them. You use the chmod or change mode command. There are 2 different ways to use it. There's the way that most people will know and tell you about, and then there's the easy way. First, I'm going to talk about the harder way that other people will know about. chmod represents file permissions using an octal number. There are going to be 3 bits in any octal number. In other words, in any number that is base 8, it will take 3 bits to represent a number from 0 to 8, from 0 to 7. This is the 4's place, this is the 2's place, and this is the 1's place. This is read, this is write, and this is execute. If I want to say that something is readable, writable, and executable, then that would mean it would have permission 7. If something is not readable, but it is writable, and it is executable, then its permission would be 3. If something is readable and writable, but not executable, then its permission would be 6. Whether you want something to be readable, writable, or executable, or anywhere in between, you can figure out what its permission should be just by adding all of these numbers together, and then coming up with this number, and that's what you'll use. You can't just use one number, because you don't just want to represent whether one user can read, write, and execute. You want to represent whether the user who owns the file can read, write, and execute, whether the group that owns the file can read, write, and execute, and whether other people can read, write, and execute. If I want myself, my group, and everybody else to be able to read, write, and execute, then I would have permission 777. If I want to be able to do everything, and I don't want my group and don't want anybody else to be able to do anything, then it would be 700. If I want to be able to read and write, and I want my group to be able to write and execute, and I want the world to only be able to read, then that would be 634. You can mix and match these however you want. And a quick aside on octal numbers. Whenever you want to tell whether you want to represent a number in decimal, or octal, or some other base, like hexadecimal, then you just have to change the first digit. So if I have a number like 77, then that is the decimal number 77. If I want to say that that is octal 77, then I would say 077. And because this is octal, that isn't actually the same as decimal 77. That's 7 times 8 plus 7, or 63. Because this number is in base 8. If you want to do hexadecimal, you just have to do 0x and then your number. So I could say 0xFF, which would be equal to 255, because these are in base 16. With chmod, it shouldn't matter whether you use octal notation or decimal notation, but there are a lot of programs where you might use one or the other, and the program will actually interpret a leading 0 as meaning that it's in octal, whereas you really meant it to be in decimal, which would confuse the output. Let's go back to the command line to see how we would actually use these octal numbers. Let's say that I want to add execute permissions to some directory. Then I would say I want it to be readable, writable, and executable by myself, and I don't want it to be anything by anybody else. Readable plus writable plus executable would be 7. Nothing from anybody else would be 0 and 0. So then I would say chmod 700 some directory. And you can see now it has read, write, and execute. If I wanted to change it back to be just readable and writable, then that would be 4 plus 2 plus 0, or 6. And now you can see it is only readable and writable and not executable. And you can see this would behave exactly the same if I did it in octal. And that's because chmod will just interpret the numbers as octal numbers, even if you don't prepend it with a 0. So that lets you specify the exact permissions that you want it to be, and that will work if you can remember exactly, I want this to be 746 or 700, or if you know the exact permissions that you want the file or directory or whatever to have. I find it a lot easier to just specify what I want to add or what I want to take away. because zshell finds it easier also, zshell will give you these suggestions when you use chmod. So let's say that I want to chmod, and then I press tab to do tab completion. It will ask me who. So let's say that I want to take away the execute permission from myself. So I want to say the user should not have execute permission, so then I would say you. Then I would say, what do I want to do? Do I want to take it away, or do I want to add it? I want to take it away, so u minus, hit tab again, and then it will ask you for what privilege you want to deal with. So there's execute, there's read, there's write, and there's a few other things that we haven't talked about. So since we want to take away the execute permission, I would say u minus x. And then after that, I would specify the file. And since I said u minus x, zshell only listed the particular files that already had execute permissions set. So if I say some directory, then you can see it is no longer executable. If I want to say the entire world can execute some directory, then I would instead say chmod tab. I want to do it to everybody, so I'll say A for all, plus, because I want to add, and execute. And then you can see here, it lists every file that doesn't have all people set to be able to execute it. And now, you can see some directory, anybody can execute it. And that's all that you need to know about the basics of file permissions and chmod.